There's consensus that the government needs to improve and increase its spending to ensure sustainable economic recovery. If the money does become available, what should it be spent on? My guest today is Professor Charan Singh, who was RBI Chair Professor at IIM Bangalore and is at eGrow now. I asked him about the policy debate on whether the government should spend on income support or on creating infrastructure. I also asked him where asset monetization fits in this plan and if outright privatization would have worked better instead. Professor Singh is very bullish on India and spoke about many themes, including the booming stock market. He made some provocative arguments, such as that rise in income inequality is inevitable and should be accepted as long as employment is increasing in the economy. I have many points of rebuttal to many of the arguments he made, but couldn't make them because the conversation was running too long and I didn't want to interrupt his flow of thoughts. For instance, would have liked to ask him, why should the 100-year-old rainwater clearance system of Bombay be acceptable if the pre-1947 Parliament building in Red Fort are not? Perhaps I'll invite him again to the show. Before I play the conversation with Professor Singh, let me apologize for not being regular with the podcast due to urgent situations outside of work. Thank you, Professor Singh, for making time for the podcast. There seems to be a consensus that government spending needs to increase for supporting sustainable economic recovery. I want to bring to the discussion, the policy debate. I want to start today's conversation by asking you if government should spend on income support or on something where it can help immediately with demand, or if it should spend on infrastructure and those kind of spending heads.
So that's a very good question, Puja, and I think it's a very relevant and contemporary issue that you are asking me. It has been in the news for a couple of months now. There have been people who've been saying, why not do a helicopter drop of money? And then there are others who say we need infrastructure and we need growth. Now, my position is like this. Please remember that there is a concept of inflation. The concept of inflation is that if the number of goods remain the same and if you put in more money, then the price of the good rises and nothing else changes. So inflation, if it is generally around 6, 7, 8%, 10%, it is okay. But if it becomes hyperinflation, which is very, very dangerous for the economy. So therefore, we have to avoid hyperinflation. In times of crisis like that we are in now, there is always a temptation to increase money supply. And that, of course, will satisfy a few people. But as a trained economist, as a professional, I would say that's not the right way to do it. Then what is the right way to do it? The right way to do it is infrastructure. Now, when you do infrastructure, and you know that infrastructure is labor intensive, moment you say it is labor intensive, then the people to whom you wanted to give money through helicopter drop of money are going to benefit from it. And in infrastructure development, you have all sort of people who are required. You may need some skilled people, but most of it you will need head load workers and general workers who are not skilled people. So, and you also need good quality engineers, you also need equipment, you also need machinery. So in a way, the whole industry gets moving. Now let me just bring 2-3 facts to your notice. When you say infrastructure development has a multiplier effect. Now what is a multiplier effect? That you spend 100 rupees, but by the time it finishes its cycle, it makes number of times more production or more employment or more income generation. Now suppose I spend 100 rupees in a road building, then I need equipment, I need manufacturers. What will the manufacturers do? They will need iron, they will need tar, they will need stones, they will need labor, they will also need some more machinery. So they will pay salaries to all those people. If I build a road, I need labor, I'm going to pay them directly wages. What are the wages going to do? They are going to go and ask for food and clothes, and therefore there's complete cycle that starts. Now the multiplier effect of capital expenditure, in which infrastructure is a part, is 5 times more than simply giving money to people. So what would you prefer? Anybody would prefer infrastructure is a good thing to do. Also, when you have good infrastructure, and you have heard the Prime Minister speak about Gati Shakti, When you have good infrastructure, you are able to mobilize things from one place to the other much faster, and therefore economic and commerce also starts developing very rapidly. So on a sustainable basis, without creating inflationary pressure, you are able to achieve the same objective that you said by income support. Now, there are people in the country which are not in the labor force, elderly people. Now, in many parts of the world, elderly people are given old age pension. Now, what's the advantage of giving old age pension, which is a sort of an income support, to the elderly? The elderly are not going to go and squander it away on drugs or liquor or such evil sin activities. They will certainly pump that money in for their daughter or their son or their grandson or granddaughter, and they'll all use it for medicine. So, old age pension is one such scheme that can meet this purpose. And once you give more old age pension, the elderly become more responsible. Their medical expenditure is taken care. Now, suppose they incur lots of medical expenditure. It goes to the pharma company. Pharma company pays salaries to people as well as goods. So again, it has a multiplier effect. It is not getting wasted anywhere and is productively used. The other thing is when we say helicopter drop of money or income support, what is income generally required for? One is you need income for basic consumption of food and cloth. The other is you need for emergencies like medicine. You also need for education. Now, what has the government done? Government in Food Corporation of India had lots of food stock which was rotting there. And we have to always every year as the season changes buy more crop because we need to support our farmers. The crop which is rotting there, sometimes not even in proper godowns, getting eaten away by ants and dogs, the government was very wise and said, not the bad one, but we have lots of ration in Food Corporation of India, rice and wheat stocks. We can use it for giving it to people. So every family or every person has been given free rations. So though you have not given income support, but you have served the same purpose. The other thing you need income support is medical help. What did the government do during this COVID time? Government said government hospitals and private hospitals are available for free medication. You can go to the hospital and get yourself treated. Nobody can say no to you. Also, vaccines can cost, but they said there are free vaccines available. So, though they did not give you direct income support, they ensured that your survival is not at stake. So, to that extent, you can say they did not give me a demand push, but they ensured that the survival is done. So, this is something very innovative which goes to the government. And in an emerging country like India, where tax collection is very low and no buffers are there or very less buffers are there, innovative schemes had to be thought of. And this is one of the innovative schemes wherein. Now I'll give you one more example. You remember when COVID started, in other countries there were data coming 40% people unemployed. The unemployment allowance zooms up to $10 billion or things like that. All big, big figures. And then the Indian finance minister in England has announced such grand schemes. Are you aware of that? Many things were done. What happened in our country? Very quietly and silently, what did the Prime Minister do? Prime Minister made an appeal. He told the private sector, please don't throw away your employees. So by virtue of that, what happened? It's a perfect example of private-public partnership. The government said, I'm giving them food support, I'm giving them medical support, but you please don't throw away your employees. So what happened? The private sector said, no, we will not. They might have gone for a salary cut. They went in for 20%, some 50%, some cases 75% salary cut. People started working from home, but the employees were not thrown. So some purchasing power in the hand of the employee continued to be there. And what purpose in Western countries, which do not have a human face generally or a human heart, They generally work in a very different way, very capitalist profit oriented. They had to give unemployment allowance. But the same purpose was being served in India by this unique public private partnership that happened. Now, this is something when COVID is over, which will be celebrated worldwide. The private sector contributed to the efforts by this ensuring employment to all their employees. So I think the very purpose of the unemployment allowance was taken care by a very unique method in our country. Now coming back to the question that you raised, what should have been done? Income support. So in a way, I'm saying some income support continued. And then the infrastructure development. One thing we should not forget, even while the COVID was on, there are certain activities that continued in our country. Defense was working, police was working, banking, insurance was working. So to that extent, people who were employed in these activities, they were actively working. So the income support continued. Now you will say, Professor, is there a proof of what I am saying? Yes. Have you seen what's happening in the stock market? Stock market never took a dip. What does that mean? That means two things. Firstly, people had purchasing power in their hand, which got diverted into the stock market. Secondly, the confidence and exuberance that people had, it continued to be there. So Indian stock market has been scaling new heights in the last 12 to 13 months. So that means overall the economy has been taken care and there was without any income support, direct income support that was being asked for, quote unquote income support, without going to that, the government achieved its purpose.
Right. Professor Singh, I was going to ask you more about infrastructure, but since you brought the point about the stock market, I want to ask you, a lot of people say that this may be an asset bubble. Another set of people, such as Sajid Chinoy from JP Morgan, has written that, this is what is they're calling a K-shaped recovery, where one section of the economy is in fact resilient, and that's a small part of the economy, but that does not mean that the entire economy, which typically in India's case does not get captured in official statistics, and definitely not in the stock market performance. Are we so sure that that part of the economy is also kind of doing all right and recovering from COVID, or has not taken a major hit because there are no economic hardships due to COVID?
Now, I must mention that stock markets have been doing very well. Normally, it is considered that the stock market will do well if the basics are strong. But one has to remember that stock market is also futuristic and lots of emotions and projections and expectations are factored in the stock market. So the stock market giving me a futuristic look shows that India is on a very strong foot. People have confidence in it, not only within India. You have seen the FDI data, you have also seen FI data. This is a country which is really inspiring others. People are feeling, whatever be the political environment, and the country is always in election mode, state or center, whatever be the political environment, the country provides immense stability. Now, which other country can you think of which provides you continuous political stability, which has one of the celebrated regulators, SEBI and RBI, which has two stock markets, National Stock Exchange and the Bombay Stock Exchange. Each one of them have 5,000 odd listed companies. And then you have a country which you call them a developing country or a poor country or an emerging country, but of the 11 vaccines that were produced, two of them have been brought up in this country. So that means the country has the R&D capacity. The country has the intellectual capital. So therefore, when you look at the booming stock market, you have to also factor in the expectations and the future growth of the economy. Now, when it comes to the second point which you raised, a K-shaped recovery, there is no doubt about it. People, as I mentioned, everything was not closed. About 40 to 50% of the economy was working, especially the services sector. Airlines also started operating very fast. So they were getting their salaries. Where would they put their money in? They can't go for travel or they can't go anywhere. Stock market was a very handy place to put their money. So they were going very steady. When it came down to the lockdowns, there were lockdowns, but every time the situation improved, the private sector was allowed to open. And also, the government, at different points of time, understanding the pressure points, came out with schemes to relieve those pressure points. So, therefore, the private sector would again start working, MSMEs would again start working, and therefore it started showing in recovery. Yes, informal sector accounts for a very large chunk of the Indian society. But again, the innovative government and their ideas, they came out with mudra loans for who? For people who put their daily carts. And who would give them the certificate? Local municipal corporation, local authorities with whom they are familiar with. So therefore, the informal sector also got the support. Now, if you go down around the city side these days, not in major towns, you will find small carts. They will have the Paytm Beam, that thing, and you can make the payment through them. So, and have you ever seen that they have closed? No. The samosa wala, the jalebi wala, the chole bhatura wala, the juice wala, they are always there. So the point that I'm trying to make is, yes, on one hand, there was consistency in those sectors where employment continued, including education who shifted to online. On the other hand, informal sector, which we thought is going to severely be impacted, government provided its support. Please again remember, in the informal sector, people live hand to mouth. But now, through the Food Corporation of India and the fair price shops, ration was reaching everywhere. So nobody died of hunger, and the money that I would have got through my salary would be used for food that has been taken care. When it comes to education, I may not be able to pay fees, but online education started playing a very important role. So many schools have shifted to online, which could afford, which couldn't afford. Yes, they have closed, no doubt about it. So the K type recovery, I am ready to accept that concept, but I would say the recovery is far more faster than would have been anticipated by the Western trained economists or those economists who sit in Western countries and make comments on India. When you are working at the grassroots level, on the ground, traveling, looking at people, you realize, yes, there were turbulent times, but it was not an impossible situation. Partly because, as I mentioned, the public private partnership, you and me, all of us have some domestic help at home. We never cut their salaries. Moment the lockdown was over, we invited them to come back. We paid for their vaccinations if required. We allowed them a few days off. So the public private partnership continued to work. This is just an illustration of people working in the informal sector. But if you look around, I have not seen a dire situation as far as economics is concerned.
Some figures have been put out about people falling back into poverty, reversal of gains against poverty. Some surveys have also been showing that how the percentage of homes that are going hungry, that percentage has increased. Are these, according to you, suspect or?
My own feeling is that in India, somehow we are never sure of what our government is doing. Unnecessarily, we are always suspect of what the government does. Rather than look at a crisis, look at an opportunity, and to be very honest with you, this government I have seen listens to the complaints and then also comes out with remedial measures. The very fact that the finance minister must have come 10 times on TV every time with some corrective measure because the feedback went and she did the corrective thing. So, in case there is any hunger anywhere or somebody, I haven't come across because I know local bodies, Panchayati Raj institutions, municipal corporations, NGOs, gurdwaras, mandirs, they were all distributing free food to anybody and everybody. And people who were in the middle income group, whatever they could do for the service, they had also been doing for them. So, therefore, for me to accept this logic that food did not reach or there were nutrition problems somewhere, that I'm not willing to accept. The question that people went into poverty, that point I'm willing to accept because what is your yardstick of poverty? If it is income, certainly income's restricted. But my point is that you needed income for certain purposes. You needed income for health, food, and education. The food was taken care, health was taken care, education shifted to online. So poverty, seeping into poverty, the way I think they need to change the definition of how they define poverty. Probably,
Or
if it is income indicator, they need to look at the consumption indicator.
consumption.
And the
But
last point I want to make
yeah.
here is generally the quality of food intake in India had improved for about the last decade with better performance of the economy and higher income. Protein rich diet was generally being adopted. Because this crisis happened, I'm sure the protein rich diet many people would not be able to maintain. They would have shifted to basic rice and wheat, which was being supplied through the Russian shops. Similarly, when the municipal corporations and NGOs and donor agencies started supplementing the food, that would have also not been very protein rich. So, if you look from that angle, yes, I'm sure some compromises have taken place. But if you look from the angle of people dying out of hunger, I don't think that has to be accepted.
And you said that health was protected, but was it really? I mean, health is in fact come out as a major, infrastructure deficit, and the health infrastructure could not really cope with the pressures of the pandemic.
You're right. I totally agree with you. I have lived in Bombay for many years. Every year there's such a heavy down rainfall that for 3 days in any year Bombay is closed. But today, you know what is happening in New York? The mayor
Same
of New
thing.
York has said that in the last 500 years we have not had such a downpour.
No,
And can you
and the
imagine?
videos of
Yes, and
rainfall water pouring into the subway is
yes,
actually
yes,
reminds of Indian cities.
yeah. And can you imagine in New York, 11 people died of rainfall?
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Why? Because in 500 years that didn't happen. When I used to live in Bombay, I used to ask them, every year there is this problem. Why don't you fix your drainage system? They said, so expensive. And the drainage system set up in Bombay is 100 years old. But to replace it is so expensive, it is better to close the city for 3 days rather than replace. Now, I want to bring the same thing to you when you ask me the health question in our country. A pandemic happened after 100 years. In the hospitals, hospital beds were for normal times. The oxygen supply was for normal times. And suddenly this pandemic happened. And when it poured so heavily that especially the second one was too severe. No doubt about it. There were deaths which took place. You and me have seen that it was very devastating. I don't deny that fact. But then it's also an eye opener for all of us. The eye opening is that the allopathic medical system, with which we are so much accustomed now, probably would not have or could not have met the requirements of this pandemic. But had we prepared ourselves for the Indian medical system, which has prevailed for 5,000 years, especially Ayurvedic, Unani, including homeopathy, and we had built those hospitals, those capabilities, and also made our people aware of the yogic exercises which can help in your breathing and build up your immunity and sustain your lungs during difficult times, probably we wouldn't have come through those devastating second wave. So yes, it is an eye opener, and I think the government is already working, or if not, should start working on integrating the Indian medical system with the allopathic medical system. The
Is this a
hurdle.
point you're making about infrastructure or the medical prescriptive, prescription or treatment?
So my view is the health infrastructure now has to be integrated with the Indian health infrastructure. So
I
far,
see.
so far for us, health infrastructure basically meant how many hospitals, how many hospital beds, things like that. But now I am saying that we have to think beyond, and if this sort of pandemics can come and we are vulnerable to it, we need to have something which avoids us getting into a situation like that, which builds our immunity, and that comes through the herbal treatments that we have in our country, even simple herbal things which build our immunity. The Ayurvedic, Unani, and the homeopathic systems need to be strengthened. Those hospitals need to be encouraged, and those practitioners need to be educated and given respectability. Those medicines need to be marketed properly. And of course, the modern health system, which is the allopathic, that also needs to be strengthened. I also feel time has come when more R&D is required in Unani and Ayurveda rather than putting all our health research budget into allopathy. So now that we have woken up to the situation, you yourself know there is lots of resistance towards vaccines because we are, as Indians, believe that our immunity is already very strong, and it is strong. There's no doubt about it. If you look at the mortality rate in our country vis-a-vis some other countries, we are not that bad off. Our averages are pretty okay or better. So therefore, we are a very strong race. We are immune, but that the immunity is generally very strong. But we need to build on it. And therefore, I think the health infrastructure which is being thought of now should not just be on hospitals which are allopathic in their philosophy. We need to build a more holistic medical system in our country. And one more thing I would like to mention, madam, that if every 100 years pandemic has come, and we are a 5,000 year odd civilization, we would have also faced many of these pandemics. We have survived through all of them. There must be something in the Indian Ayurvedic system or Indian yogic system which had built our immunity and we survived those. Those need to be researched and brought out so that we don't only depend on steroids. At the end of the day, as you know, that the modern treatment for the pandemic was basically dependent on steroids.
Right.
Plasma was plasma, and the other remdesivir was
Yeah,
also negated by the World Health Organization.
true.
So, therefore, I think we need to do more research on the Indian health system and then bring it up.
So we are back to the topic of the day, which is infrastructure spending by the government. There, how do you suggest this should be implemented for best results? And particularly since, there's also simultaneously asset monetization that the government has announced and is carrying out. So how does that fit into this plan? On the one hand, you're going to create new infrastructure. On the other hand, you're going to monetize existing assets. How do the two go hand in hand? And also, I think this fits in because that's where the money, the financing of this new infrastructure is going to come from. So help us understand, these two things
So,
simultaneously.
so that's very important because if we have to revive the economy, this is something very, very important that you are asking. Infrastructure is one which will help us revive the economy. Now, let me make a few observations before I go further in this. Now, as you know, India was the richest country on the planet for 1000 years, accounting for nearly 33% of world output. America today only accounts for 21% of world. So you can imagine how powerful India must have been, accounting for 33%, and not for 60 years, 70 years, 10 decades, no, for 1000 years. For 2000 years later, we were accounting between 21 and 33% while our decline was happening. And then, of course, you know, the last 1000 years of Indian history, what happened that in 1947, our country, which was the golden sparrow for thousands of years, was reduced to 90% people below the poverty line. So I don't have to go. Now, the question is when we were the richest on the planet, what was the mantra? To me, the mantra was simple. Government restricted itself to basic things currency and coinage, defense, judicial, law and order, right? Private sector flourished because we adopted the socialist pattern of society under the Nehruvian philosophy. What happened? The private sector was totally suffocated, and it was the public sector which was at the heights, and those were the temples of modern India. I think that's wrong strategy. The private sector has to be encouraged. Now, if you want to attain a $5 trillion economy or a 10 or want to equal China's 14 trillion or want to equal America's 21 trillion, do you think that the public sector will do it? No, it is the private sector which will do it. So the private sector has to be encouraged at any cost. They will lead the brigade into this. So I think when we need to grow, we need to unleash the passion of the private sector. This government is doing it, but I think we need to unleash it further. The private sector has to become a partner in everything that we do, even the defense. You see, what does public private sector want? They want a peaceful environment and they want their investment to be safe and secure. Why should they not participate in defense activities? Because at the end of the day, if they produce some defense equipment, binoculars, or guns, they know it is in their own interest that the country's borders are secure. Otherwise, you will have Taliban here. Nothing is safe. So the private sector has to be encouraged to lead the brigade now. In the asset monetization, this is exactly what I see. It is the brownfield projects. Capital investment has already been done. The private sector can come in and say, look, I will run it for you. And whatever the contractual basis, it's bidding which is going to take place, whatever be the contractual basis, on the basis of that, the contract can be signed for 15, 20, 25 years. You've seen Hong Kong had a contract for 99 years. It went back after the lease deed got over. Similarly, in India, we can do the same thing. Profits can be shared. Even if the profits are not shared, the most important thing is at least the loss will not be on the union budget. That itself is a very big deal. So therefore, I think the asset monetization scheme of the government is wonderful scheme. It is an initiative of a government which is constrained on resources. Tax collection in any pandemic are always down. You have to borrow, but borrowing is always a long-term tax commitment. Because when I borrow, I have to pay interest rate and that will come from the tax. I have to repay the borrowing that also comes from tax. So borrowings are nothing else but postponement of tax liability. Asset monetization is not. Asset monetization is quote unquote a rental arrangement. Somebody has built a house, I can stay in it, I can pay some rent and take the benefits. It is something like a lease agreement, which we all know. So I think the government's effort of asset nationalization, monetization of asset is a brilliant scheme which the private sector should come and take it forward. I know there must be worries. As you and me know, disinvestment in this country never took off because many people feel that they'll get entangled into something which is later on cases open up and say you did the disinvestment at a price. But let me also tell you, I was in the Reserve Bank, heading the fiscal division of the Reserve Bank research wing, and that is in 97. We were asked to find out in this investment how to price different things. How do you price Air India? It's a challenge, right? So we struggled in the division to find out the pricing method, and we couldn't because whatever price you fix, how do you know this is the right price, which will be attractive to the private sector to come in, and you will no case will open against you that you sold them easy. Similarly, even now that will be a challenge. And therefore, in the asset monetization, bidding has to take place. And incidentally, at EGRO Foundation, we are invited the auction guru, Paul Milgram, Nobel laureate, to come and tell us how auctions should be conducted, which are beneficial. I myself in the Reserve Bank was engaged in the auction system while government securities were involved, which is a better auction, which is not good, and we have discussed that. Similarly, when asset monetization will take place, bidding will be very important and that can be modernized. But I think it's a great opportunity for the private sector to go in for. As far as infrastructure is concerned, a minute before I told you that the multiplier effect of infrastructure is very high. Employment orientation is very high. But I want to give you one suggestion now before I close this segment of your. Now, you see, housing sector is one of those sectors which has forward backward linkages. And you know, the forward backward linkages in housing are around 275 industries. In the house that you and me are sitting, we only think of cement, steel, iron, some plastic switches, and some basins. But about 275 industries enter into a house. If I'm able to build houses and sell them, I have in a way encouraged 275 industries. some in large sector, some in MSME sector, some even in village and cottage industry, right? Now, when the central vista is being made in Delhi, what is happening? Everybody is opposing it. I'm so surprised. What is happening with that? 20,000 crore is being spent on goods, materials, salaries, wages. What is it? It's pumping money into pumping demand in the hands of people. Now, suppose every state, and I wanted actually in my writings, I've written that if Australia could build their own capital, new capital, Canberra, why couldn't India build it? Because when you build a city, you bring in so much of new industry, and those industries which are slumping, which are struggling, they start growing. Now, India has purchasing power. Stock market is a clear indicator. Many Indians still don't have a house. If in every state capital, the housing board in Delhi, DDA, and similarly housing boards in every state, if they start building houses, 275 industries encourage, people have purchasing power to buy houses, you will see that the whole economy starts growing up. I do not know why people are shy of this. This is the best way to make people own a house because everybody needs a house, and the best way to start the economy growing faster. I wish, and I sincerely wish, and sorry to mention this, it's a little digression. I always used to feel 75 years of independence and India's parliament sits in those structures which were built by the British. When will we become really independent? And Delhi is a capital in which they lived. I would have loved to have a capital which is new. I have written also that when the Prime Minister speaks from the ramparts of the Red Fort, it doesn't give me good feeling because I get that we were slaves at one point of time of some dynasty. So if we start building new structures, new cities, you can imagine. The last point I want to make in this segment, madam, that look, in India, we are very fortunate. 5,000 year civilization means we have very, very old places here. And some of them are extremely important for our culture. And therein, the Ayodhya, Banaras, Kurukshetra, Panipat, Mathura play a very important role. Both are there. These cities should be modernized and the old ones should be preserved, but the other side of the cities should be modernized to encourage tourism into the Indian culture. We from India go to various parts of the world to look at their different places and forts, and we go far off places to see little forts. We are so fortunate in our own country. We have 5,000 old year civilization. We have wells, we have bricks, we have buildings which have that 5,000 years. Why are we not developing it? We can develop the cities around it and we can also develop tourism around it. Tell me, what more do we need to grow? We have things sitting with us. We need to just channelize our thoughts and investment and make the best of it. That is where I think we need to monetize.
Professor Singh, you've made many points. I want to go back to one of your points, which was on housing. If I'm not wrong, we have huge inventories of unsold flats and houses across cities. Do you think is it's a price point affordable housing that you're talking about, or would you want to clarify on that point?
Yes. So, yes, you are right. In the housing segment, there are various segments. There are luxury houses, which some Indians can afford. There are other houses which middle income people like me and you can afford. And there are low income houses which people who are still coming out of the poverty line can afford or need to afford. There are people living in slums and we need to do away with the slums, and those are the houses which we can provide them. So there are different segments of the society which will demand different type of houses. My reading of the situation is luxury houses will be required in places like Bombay and Delhi, metropolitans, but most of the cities would require middle income and low income housing structure. The five cities which I mentioned to you, Mathura, Panipat, and all these, even people like you and me, when we retire, would like to prefer or at least have a holiday home in these places. And so, therefore, we need to have compact housing schemes for such places which are treated like holiday homes where people would come stay for a certain point of time. In the housing segment, there are various ways you can monetize that housing sector. You can also, and this is another thing I want to bring to your notice, and this is going out of your question, but is on housing. You know, because of pandemic, many of people lost their income sources. While I was supported with food, medicine, but I lost the income source. But I have a house. Why can't the government and the banks come out with reverse mortgage? Once you come out with reverse mortgage, the bank pays you a sort of a monthly pension and you monetized your own house and it
I
gives
think
you.
it was experimented with, no, a few years ago.
It was experimented. It did not succeed because those were normal times and people said in India, parents want to leave their house not with the bank but for their son or daughter. But in these abnormal times, I think we need to revive reverse mortgage. Banks are sitting flushed with funds. They can start paying and monetizing these houses. And once the economy recovers and revives 10 years, then these houses, at least the purchasing power has been put in the hands of the people, and this house can go back to the bank, or the bank can sell it back to me if need arises. So I think in the housing sector, it is one asset which not only revives the economy, helps revive the economy, it is an asset which has lots of potential of growth.
And one other question I wanted to ask you is that, when we talk about asset monetization, which essentially means that a relationship between private sector and government system for an extended period of, say, 30 years or so, does our government at that level, at the level of these assets, is there capacity to take on board private sector concerns and, have a relationship with the private sector for this period of time? Or we are going to see increase in crony capitalism, concentration of a few large business houses literally capturing India's, government's assets and infrastructure.
Well, now you have used so many words, crony capitalism and all that. My point is very simple. Unfortunately, income inequalities have been rising rapidly across the world. It is a dream for every Indian to go and see what New York looks like. But the income inequalities in New York are much more severe than that of India. There is no country that I have gone and with my age and experience being to many countries. In every country, there are 5 or 10 families which even a street vendor knows that they are the richest. You can't help it. This is bound to happen. Some will capitalize on the situation, others will not. In one period, Mr. B will be the richest, in other period, Mr. A will be the richest. This churning keeps taking place. Income inequalities by virtue of this capitalist system is bound to happen. In the communist world also you found that income inequalities had started. So I would not worry too much about income inequalities. What I would worry is if employment is created, everybody is fully engaged. And I want to make one more point to you, which I missed speaking earlier. When people say just give them income support, they forget if easy money comes my way, three things will happen. Either somebody will become a Maoist, or they will become, as it happened, terrorists, or they'll become extremely useless. The money that comes, and Gandhiji himself said it, you should be able to justify your earning. You have to keep the mind and body engaged. Otherwise, it is a destructive way of financing just the income. You have to have productive ways, engaging mind and body so that assets are created. So, therefore, the point I am making now is you have to have schemes which create employment. If I'm able to create employment, if it leads to a certain more income inequalities, I'm not worried. This is how the systems somehow the inbuilt default in the system. But what I want is if the employment increases, spending increases, the whole economy benefits, I would rush for it. As far as your question is concerned, does the private sector have the capacity? Does the government also have the accommodative stance? My reading is whatever said and done, If the economy has to gallop to a $21 trillion economy and compete with America, or even a $14 trillion economy and become China, China had also to give up its communist ideology. They gave up. There's hardly any communist party the way we were growing up in China today. So some remnants may be there in India of the old vintage, but otherwise, even the communist, and I've interacted with the people from the Communist Party in Stanford for 18 months. I'm not talking from a book, I'm talking from my interaction. The communist ideology that you and me are familiar with, or what is taught to us by our CPM friends, is different from that in
Yeah,
China. They have
yeah.
opened up, they have expanded, they have experimented with the private sector. Just imagine in 1978, no foreign company could operate on the soil of China because they were dead against the capitalist world. Today, there is no company worth its name which is not operating on the soil of China. China has accommodated all of them. 9 lakh 61 companies are operating on China despite the pandemic and the bad name that they've got. Nobody has left China. They've only opened second office in Vietnam, Estonia, or Bangladesh. So therefore, the ideology has changed. So therefore, even in India, if we want to grow and expand, we will have to accommodate the private sector. The private sector suddenly will not become capable of running the most sophisticated. We will need to handhold them. You know what? I'm thinking there are assets, commercial, public sector assets, which are operating, doing well. Every now and then, there are a drain on the national exchequer, on the budget. Why does the government not think of even placing these assets in the hands of the private sector and say run it? Now you see when we started private sector banks in 1992-93, we were so scared. But today private sector banks, Kotak Mahindra, and I don't want to name them because, but there are a series of private sector banks run by Indians who are doing better and performing better than many public sector banks.
In fact, the intention of my question was to say that why not go for outright privatization? And secondly, when we talk about infrastructure development, can it not be that the private sector is encouraged to step up investments in infrastructure? I'm actually making a case for more private sector involvement and the government not getting out of ownership of these assets that it's trying to lease out, in fact.
I totally agree with you. As much as privatization is possible, should be done. Private sector should also come out more aggressively and demand that they are capable of doing it. Give it to us, try on us. To me, I would say leasing is a better thing. Why? Because see, we tried disinvestment, we were not very successful. We wanted to privatize. There is so much of resistance which comes from various quarters saying that you are selling government assets. Problem in privatization is determining the right price. If you do not get the right price, everybody can then open a case after 5 years against you and they can tell you that you sold the family silver at the rate of some iron, which is a difficult accusation to get away with. Therefore,
So,
privatization people will
so
be shy. But
So, in
then,
fact, I want to interject here and say that we have examples from the past. Maruti privatization is in fact successful compared to, let's say, coal auctions or spectrum auctions, which are closer to this leasing mechanism. So, our own, past examples show that outright privatization is actually better.
no, there are few such examples. But then you know what happened in the Spectrum case. And you also know one government had to lose its job because some civil servant made a point, and that figure didn't turn out to be true later. But then the government lost its job. The point I'm making is privatization is a challenge. It will be opposed, and those some of the accusations of privatization may turn out to be genuine and true. So many people will not be ready to take the risk. If you tell them privatize, they will say yes, but sit on the file till the next government comes. The asset monetization is a middle path. 25 years down the line, if somebody has under the asset monetization, run my program, at that point of time, the government and the private sector is willing to sit and negotiate. There is more acceptability. Then why not tell that same private sector to, okay, you've run it for 50 or 30 years, do you want to take it now? and the bidding will be available, the pricing will be available, and then one can sort of
As happened with the Taj Hotel in
can
Delhi.
shelf it off to the other party. But this is a middle path, which I think is a prudent path, which the government has chosen. You know, you and me are not the standard Indians. Still, there are many Indians in our country who will think that the public sector should be everywhere. Whereas, if you look at the India's 3,000 year of history when we were the golden sparrow, private sector was everywhere. The government
True,
only did, again, to be repetitive,
true,
currency
true,
coinage, defense, law and order. That's all.
true, true,
That is
true,
the way we will be able to get into a high income bracket.
true.
Public sector cannot.
And the average listener will also have a confusion on their mind, which is that this plan right now seems to be that whereas the taxpayer will finance the creation of infrastructure because of these plans of infrastructure funding, it will be managed and therefore bulk of the profits will be taken away by the private sector. So it seems like, not a very cogent idea to the average listener. If you could explain this.
Look, at a time, the thought comes, even if the taxpayer may paid the money to build this road, and now the government has handed over this road to the private sector. Look how clever the government is. They have taken the taxpayers' money and they have benefited the private sector, right? This is the
Yeah,
accusation.
yeah,
Now
yeah.
let us steer into this accusation. When the government built the road, some cost was incurred. Who incurred the cost? Who got the salary? Who brought in the material? All of us. I might have paid the tax, but I also have the advantage of going from point X to point Y on the same road. I saved lots of money. Otherwise, I was going from X to somewhere and then reaching difficulty Y. So that asset I have benefited. The salaries that were paid to my own brothers and sisters. The goods and material that was procured to finance that road was also paid to my brothers and sisters, some in the private sector, some in the government sector. At the end of the day, it was a national asset which was built. While it was being built through the taxpayers' money, even then I was benefiting as a private sector. Now, if I continue to have it in the public sector, it is running into losses. My tax money is going into running it on daily basis. Now that it has been built, I can make profits out of it. I just hand it over to someone. At least I don't have to pay through the budget for this loss making body. Rather, this man, the private sector who gets it, he makes profit out of it. What will he do with profits? He will either employ more people, or he'll buy more things, or he'll invest somewhere. Even if he does luxury expenditure, he goes and stays in a five-star hotel. What happens in a five-star hotel? Again, he spends money. Daily, he spends money. The salaries and wages, the food, the cook, the chef, the driver, everybody is benefiting. At the end of the day, the private and public sector is too much of a notional divide. It is me and you, me and my brothers, some in public, some in private sector, who build it. Me, again, when it is sold, me and my brothers and sisters in the public and private sector who are benefiting from it. The crux of the story is if it continues, it takes away the taxpayers' money. It is better I shelf it off so that I can now invest somewhere else and monetize that asset after 10 years. So this is how I would interpret it and tear it open.
Or probably, monetize roads and maybe use the money to build more hospitals and schools, which in any case is the government's job, and the private sector may not be too willing to do it.
Yes, and parks. You need environment. You see now a smog tower is coming up in Delhi. So who's burning the stubs for which I needed a smog tower? The government
Private
is not
sector.
burning the stubs, right? So therefore there comes a time that when you start prioritizing what lump sum expenditure is required, let the public sector do it. If I can do with running something which they have done, let me do it because that doesn't need a lump sum capital expenditure. So, in a way, at the end of the day, it is the nation that is going to sit in the galaxy of nations and claim it is $5 trillion or a $21 trillion. It's not you and me in the public or the private sector. Tell me, when you go to America, does it matter to anyone when you say I'm an employee of government of India or I'm an employee of a private sector? It doesn't. They look at you, your spending power. They look at you at your how you conduct yourself, and that is their respect. You are from India. That's what matters to them. So at the end of the day, this thing we have to give up. We have to only keep continuously thinking. If we have to grow, we have to grow together. And the history shows it is the private sector which takes the country forward, not the public sector. India's history shows.
On that note, Professor Singh, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.